Now I gotta say, to have two directors that I have huge respect for in the horror world release movies within a week of each other feels a bit greedy. Now, last week was Ty West's Maxine, and this week is Osgood Perkins' Longlegs. Now, Perkins has a much different style than the more grounded, visceral West. Instead, he kind of plays with atmosphere, mood, and more of an off-kilter aesthetics than West does. His movies tend to be more about the vibe than the stories itself. As a matter of fact, the stories tend to be a bit more threadbare and can almost be somewhat loose in parts, essentially telling you just enough to understand what's going on, but not quite enough for the pieces to fit in place snugly. Now, I loved The Black Coat's Daughter, or February, whatever the hell it's calling itself now. I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House was moody and effective, but I'll be honest, I remember nothing about the story. And Gretel and Hansel had such fantastic production design, acting, and atmosphere, but the story was the weakest part. Longlegs is a 2024 movie about an FBI agent that is tasked with finding a serial killer known only as Longlegs. Now, the interesting thing about Longlegs is the slight break from the subgenre that it inhabits. It's a serial killer movie. In serial killer style movies, there tends to be a bit more of a procedural way that clues are assembled, and as the movie is figured out, slowly each clue is put together in a way that builds on top of each other to slowly reveal the method or the killer. Now, this movie starts out that way, but kind of abandons the need to find clues and instead runs through a series of sort of experiences with odd and eccentric characters involved. It's a change of pace for this type of movie, and I think, for the most part, it's its biggest weakness. The story felt a little sparse in the first half, only to kind of rush through all the explanations in the last act of the film. I would have liked to have the information paced out a little bit more evenly. I mean, fortunately, the other aspects in this film are so good that some of it can just be excused. Now, Longlegs is about an FBI agent named Harker, played by Maika Monroe, and she seems to have some kind of extra intuition. They stop short of calling it a quote-unquote psychic power, but she's able to know certain things on the job.
It's hard to explain, sir. It's like something tapping me on the shoulder, telling me where to look.
Now, after she solves a particular case with this perception, she ends up getting brought into a case that the FBI have been trying to solve for decades. It's a series of family murders that they can't seem to connect the dots on, and they wouldn't even think that it was the same killer, except for the fact that there are a bunch of letters left at the scene from a person named Longlegs. Now, this is a kind of classic setup, and one that always works for this type of movie. Now, the one thing I'll say is her uncanny ability to intuit things never really seems to play a role in the hunt for this killer. Like, the steps that she does make are partially given to her in a way that made me think that the Sixth Sense was just a way to get her there, but they didn't really have any interest in making it about that. Apparently, there seems to be some connection between her and Longlegs, and the movie's more interested in that connection than in her actually taking the steps to solve the case. Now, in a lot of ways, this does follow the framing of a serial killer movie, where she looks at the evidence on hand and we're told all the crazy ways in which things happen. She then is trying to find a new angle into finding this guy, but it takes some different approaches and some left and right turns, staying away from a typical serial killer movie. From a character perspective, Harker is the type of character that is more at home solving puzzles than people, and she's very socially awkward and probably on the spectrum, at least seemingly very detached from the desire of human interaction. Like, she talks to her mom every day, but she doesn't seem to have any friends, and it seems like the work is everything to her. Now, I won't go into a straight up beat by beat on the plot because, there's turns here that get into spoiler territory, and it feels unnecessary in order to give my thoughts on the movie as a whole. Also, the details themselves don't alter my opinion of the movie itself. I will say that, as I mentioned at the top, the story left me a little bit more confused than I would have wanted, as there are a few things that didn't quite fit together in a way that made sense to me. Perhaps a second viewing would solve that, or maybe it's meant to be purposely vague. I just had some questions about the end game for all involved. But where the bread and butter for this movie lives is in the style of its telling, rather than the telling itself. The camera work and framing of certain shots really adds to the creepiness, and its production design is fantastic. The idea of a satanic cult coupled with a serial killing isn't really anything new, but the angle this movie takes is slightly different in what it chooses to focus on. Also, I can't believe I haven't mentioned Nick Cage yet in this entire review, but Nick Cage was appropriately bonkers. I have to believe that Perkins just put him in makeup and let him do whatever the fuck he wanted, and that's not a bad thing. His performance here is fantastic. Okay, I do have to get into a little bit of nitpick territory. This is nothing huge, and for me, nitpicks are things that they don't necessarily alter my enjoyment of the film, but they're just random things that kind of enter my little brain pan during the course of the movie and figured I would mention them. So the first thing is a technical nitpick. The opening and at certain parts of this movie, it has a change in aspect ratio of 4:3. And it also has like these rounded corners, and it appears like it's trying to emulate Super 8 film. But the image itself is way too sharp for that film stock. Like if you're gonna use that framing, use the film. So it just feels like more of a post-production decision versus something that was decided either in pre-production or production itself. The second nitpick is Maika Monroe herself. Now, I really like her as an actor. She's always solid in anything I've seen her in. And from what I've seen of her, she usually tends to play characters that are a bit more emotional. And so her stoic turn as Harker was an interesting change for her. However, if I'm being honest, I'm not sure those two sides quite fit right in this one. Now, you could be stiff as a character and still portray a lot as an actor, but I found in this in places that her stiffness felt more like a flat performance than giving us more information from that character.
From time to time, sir.
Well, maybe we'll just call you highly intuitive.
Yes, sir.
Like I said, nothing to ruin the movie, but just something I notice. In the end, Longlegs is a fascinating tale and enthralling to watch. It never really drags or wanes. The story did feel a little sparse, leaving with a lot of questions at the end as to what really happened and where does it go from here. But it was an enjoyable film with a lot of vision and captivating performances. I'd give it a B+, but let me know what you think.